maybe nobody wants to worship the devil, but all of us, for some reason, are tempted to deny his work in all these areas. And then watch the impact and actually side with those dark forces by leaving over anybody who's trying to address the impact of those choices, right? Welcome back to Jesus versus America. Jesus told us that we could not serve two masters, and so many of us are trying to follow Jesus while also being influenced and sometimes even giving in to the American culture. I'm John, and I'm joined by my friends Monique and Wisdom, and today we're also joined by our good friend Aaron, and together we represent three generations that are faithfully trying to follow Jesus. And our topic today is, why is the church and Christians in general so fragile on issues of race? If you're a pastor listening to this, you probably know this all too well at this point. If your church is growing too big, if you're tempted to follow the American culture and the only measure of success is to grow the church as big as you can, and you think that maybe you need to rethink that, the fastest way to trim down your church and prune it down to size is preach on structural racism. And that will take care of the problem you have of trying to follow the American culture. You won't need to do much. You'll just need to do that and then not respond to emails that come in that week and not take meetings with angry people who are threatening to take their money and leave your church. And your church will quickly be brought down to size to a group of people. It will also have the other side effect of making you a multi-ethnic church, because most of the people who left will leave behind the people who are somewhat diverse in their views.
Get them,
so
John.
We didn't want to bury the lead today. We wanted to just bring up front and ask that question because it's right in the title of what we're doing today. And I want to just open there. Why is that? Why are we seeing that you can talk about many things in church? Yeah. You can bring up things that I think even the scripture itself calls offensive. And yet when we get to subjects around race, it seems to thin out the crowd quickly. Yeah. Is there someone that wants to kind of start with why are we seeing that? Or we can also start with just what have we seen and experienced in our own experiences at different churches?
The eyes are over here. That's such a hard question. So we were talking a little bit about this before we started filming. Why do people leave? And the only thing I could think of is I don't know. And everything I'm about to say is sort of coming from assumptions or what I'm gathering or what I'm thinking is the climate. But it's really hard as someone who grew up my mom is immigrated here from Mexico, so I'm first generation born here, Latina. And then my grandparents were essentially refugees, survivors of the Holocaust, and ended up via many other countries, finally New York. So my dad's first generation born here. Wow. So my upbringing, it was already diverse. So I'm already experiencing life very differently, and I react to these things very differently. Mm-hmm. One of the first churches I remember going to was local to where I live, which is very diverse. So the people there by nature, there was a pastor who was a Black pastor, a Latino pastor, every type of ethnicity as far as attendance. So this is a hard one for me because I see it, but I kind of see it out there and experience it a little bit. I would say white fragility or shame. It's once you start to bring up this topic, people might feel responsible or don't want to be blamed for generations past. My great-great-great-granddaddy, they just don't know what to do with it maybe. Yeah. So it's fear, and it's I'm not a bad person. You're the one that's overly sensitive. These are the things that I assume, but again, I'm not in that, but I have seen it happen. One of the first experiences I've had was at a church at the pandemic. Was a very divisive time. Will we meet? Will we not meet? Will it be strictly by internet, which it was. They started to stream, wearing masks, not wearing masks. The Black Lives Matter protest started. Mm-hmm. Those topics started to come up, and that church that I was, kind of a part of did thin out a lot. And people were like, I thought you believed what I believed, and like, you're aligning yourself with this movement that is clearly against Christianity, so I'm leaving. So that was my first experience as a grown adult. I think at the time I was like 39 in the pandemic, where I was like, oh, like, we're not past this. I mean, I knew we weren't past it, but to the degree of not past it, I was not aware, like, that it was to that degree, like how, like, we think we've come so far. And I'm like, oh, I really assumed our country was farther, or our faith, the church, was farther along in this than it is. So, yeah.
Yeah, Aaron, what's been your experience with this recently, especially? Have you noticed that that's been a subject that's hard to talk about and that causes people to just be unable to stay in the same place?
Yeah, I think recently, so I was living down in LA for a time, and then I moved back home to Sacramento and went to the church that I grew up in, which is a predominantly white church. And it's been interesting seeing how they've dealt with this racial moments in our history right now, and seeing like there's a lot of times there's a fear of speaking out, of what will we lose if we speak out? And sometimes it's not explicitly said.
Like the church, like who is afraid of, who is speaking out?
Oh,
like,
who's
is
speaking
it,
out?
Is
I
it
think
the
it's like
church
leadership.
is afraid? Okay, leadership is afraid to speak out.
Yeah, where it's like, okay, what is the cost? Because I think for leaders of churches, like, they've been through situations, sometimes because of things that have happened within the church, sometimes through outside circumstances where people have left. And I think what I've seen is that can be traumatizing for a church leader, where they're like, oh man, that's disruptive. That's disruptive. People who I once called my friends are now leaving. And so I think people sometimes start counting the cost too early, at the sake of maybe courageous speaking out. And then another reason for congregants, why they kind of take their ball and move, and why they move on, man, I think it's a whole host of reasons, but I think a lot of it comes from a discomfort of, I don't want to sit in you can challenge my faith in these specific areas. You can challenge me to give more. You can challenge me to be nicer to my neighbors, but you cannot challenge me to change my worldview and the way I've been thinking about race for the last however long I've been alive. And as soon as you start to do that, it starts to really pull at all these other things that have been wrapped up, like our conception of race and race relations. If you don't think that when Martin Luther King marched, then everything was all good, and we have to do stuff now, like, that's super threatening to a lot of people. And I think that causes us, well, not us, because this is not my problem, but
he said that causes y'all.
That causes
to
white folks in particular to say, I don't think I can work through this, or I don't want to work through this, and I don't want to be challenged in this way, and I think you're wrong. And so then that's, if we don't believe the same thing, then we need to go somewhere else where I do believe the same thing.
But if there's a judgment in it. It's, if we don't believe the same thing about this, it means that I've got to go somewhere else because you're not preaching the gospel. There's a judgment that comes with it, right? There's a spiritual judgment that comes with it. And that's the part that I find so interesting, especially among Christians, is that they start to look at the entirety of what you've preached as a pastor, the entirety of the way the church is being run. And like you said, you can preach on money, which should challenge anybody in the United States if who's listening to a sermon, because we're all so, we're also tied up in the culture of comfort and affluence and those things. But that doesn't drive people out. You can preach on very difficult things, right? That you could even preach a sermon on divorce, and that might challenge maybe a third of your congregation who've experienced that, right? Yeah. That doesn't cause them to go and say, that's it, I'm out of here. You're antithetical to the gospel. But the moment you bring up certain things, and for example, say the federal government and the Department of Justice on their own have determined that laws are unjust that they themselves are enforcing. And they report every year about the disparate impact to minority communities of the laws that are on the books. So there's an example of what a structural racism might look like. You might just say, this is a fact. This report gets issued, and I can cite from the United States government's own report about sentencing and disparate impacts to minority communities. And then suddenly you're not preaching the gospel anymore, even though they listened to everything else you'd ever said, challenging or otherwise. Now suddenly you've abandoned the faith. And that's why they're going to another church. It's not so much that there is a discomfort, but they flip it around a lot of times and it becomes an indictment on you. And I think anybody who's been in that situation knows that loss of relationship you're talking about, where they are. I mean, we know people who their closest friends have just said the meanest things and left the church the moment that somebody said, hey, I need to comment on something that's going on in our society right now. And it'd be really strange not to do so in this moment.
Yeah.
And that just broke the friendship completely.
I would say, I have another thing, and maybe I want to know if you guys relate or have seen this, and I think this is a new thing that's emerged with politics in the last 10 years, is that the issue of race in churches usually gets clumped in with other topics that have nothing to do with it. When I found that, people at a church that I've been to, when the pastor preaches on justice during, 2020, they're like, well, before you know it, the LGBTQ and you're like, where did that even come from? Like, it kind of gets lumped into all these other things. And I think there's a fear of, if he's going to talk about this, then he's going to talk about this, and then this, and this, and this. And then I might as well leave now because the church is headed, I've heard this word, they're headed a different way or a different direction. And it's like headed a different, they lumped it in, right? Like they lump it in with all these other things. Yeah. And it feels like, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just going to say that, and that's like such a whole other issue. Just to quickly touch on, if anybody's watching as part of the LGBTQ, we will be doing a whole podcast on that. So I don't want to throw that out like, oh, that's the hill we all die on, and it's, I mean, we just don't have time to unpack that. But it is something that the Christian congregation as a whole goes to, right? We know there's an issue.
They lump in on immigration issues. They lump in with climate change, and you're like, this is like, there's so much going on.
But it's very interesting because it shows part of the inconsistency we have. Like, they say that a lot of times what drives people is fear, right?
Yeah.
But that doesn't go far enough, because it seems that many of the Christians are only afraid of some things, but not other things. Like, they're not afraid of taking guns to church and having open carry. Like, they're not afraid of that. Like, God forbid we have a mask mandate, or they're not afraid of a global pandemic, right? But they are afraid of something like, talking about maybe the climate changing or some sort of environmental stewardship that we have. And it's so interesting how we pick and choose what we're afraid of.
Justice for some, not justice for all.
Well, but we're so concerned about Christian persecution and government overreach, and yet you're talking about people in actual scenarios who've been oppressed by laws that we all can see on the books. And yet we're not afraid of that.
Right.
But we are afraid of an imagined Christian persecution, which, look, I can say it's not completely imagined, and there is some erosion of rights, but to put them on the same scale and say, so 300 or 400 years of writing laws specifically to police and govern certain kind of communities, and then saying that now lately you might not be able to say whatever you want without somebody saying, hey, don't bring that to work. I mean, I understand they're just not equivalent.
Not the same.
They're not the same
we are
thing.
not the same.
But it is interesting how we're collectively afraid of only the things that line up with our views.
Right.
And that says something, because it means that maybe what's really being challenged
is your I was just going to say, it hit me earlier, and I'm looking at our artwork over here. That's the whole thing about Jesus versus America. Like, as soon as I was like, I don't know why John and all of you wonderful, wise people started speaking, and it just came to me, I'm like, it's because there's a perversion of our identity. And so we think our identity is in Christ, but really our identity is in our political / worldview. And we maybe don't know that we've made that an idol. And so if your identity really is in Jesus and in pursuing Jesus, then you're like, Jesus cared about justice. Yeah, let's talk about it, let's unpack it. But if what comes first, and maybe you don't know what comes first, is, but socialism will kill this country and it's the great evil and we can't, or whatever it is, like anything political that guides that you're afraid of, or just justice is touching on this thing that's all of a sudden you're realizing like your identity is actually wrapped up in like your world, your, socioeconomic or your political.
A good question to ask is, what are you protecting?
Yeah.
What like and so what if it's not protected? Is Jesus not on the throne?
Yeah.
like
Well, I think it comes
that's a
from,
good point. That's a good point.
like the idea of white supremacy, right? So going all the way back until like papal bulls that were decreed by the Pope to say, all right, you white people going to America, you have a right to this land, to Christianize the savages there, and to take this land and make it your own. And so there's been this allyship between Christianity and the idea of white people being at the top of the totem pole and having the right to whatever they want. So as soon as you start to threaten any type of order where we say, hey, we as Christians should lay down our privilege for the least of these, should lay down our power, our privilege, so that those who are least can be lifted up in the name of Jesus. As soon as you start to do those things, you threaten white supremacy, and you threaten the order in which white people are at the top of things.
Hundreds and hundreds of years.
Hundreds of years. Yeah. And so it's not just discomfort. It's not just, oh man, it's not even just about politics, because you'll see this even in a liberal church or like a progressive church where, most people lean on the left a little bit. If you really start going after the power dynamic of the church and who has power in that church and say, instead of elevating the same people that we've always elevated, let's elevate someone who's poor, who's black, who's a single mother to the elder board or something like that. You're like, no, because that person doesn't have social power, doesn't have social privilege.
Yeah.
But if we look at how Jesus works, he flips that upside down.
Yes, he does.
And he gives that person the most honor in the kingdom.
And he always asks us to give up our rights. This is the interesting thing, is that I know a lot of people that are contemporaries of ours are like, look, I wasn't around for all that 500 years, 700-year history.
They're like, not me. I'm not racist.
I'm not privileged either. Like, I'm just like everybody else trying to make ends meet, and they don't recognize this, how much they've benefited from things that, yes, they had nothing to do with. I mean, they were born way after some of these things started, but they're living in a system that's still, but it's offensive to them to say that, you know what, you actually do have a head start in some ways that other people have. And they get offended by that, not remembering that Jesus himself said, even if you had a right, I mean, even if you recognize it, you should surrender that, right? Like this isn't about you getting yours. If the Roman soldier could make you go 1 mile, that was the legal limit. You give up your rights under the law and go 2, right? If you had a right to sue when someone struck you on one side of the cheek, just turn the other and let them strike you again. Not to be passive, but to show that I'm not going to retaliate. I'm going to give up my right to sue you over this. And I'm going to allow you to I'm just going to turn it to you and show you that I'm even willing to have it done again. Like, most Americans could not understand a Lord who says, don't rely on your rights. And I think the other thing you picked up on is just the way that it's worked in so many of our churches. I was looking at a study done by a professor at Ohio State University who's a believer, and she's a person of color looking at multi-ethnic churches. And her conclusion after 10 or more years of studying this longitudinal study of how these churches performed is that the ones that actually could stay together were the ones that adopted a white culture within the church. And that even in multi-ethnic churches, most of them are not led by people of color. They're mostly still being led by people who are white. And if it became, too much to one side or the other of any kind of ethnicity, most of the people, again, would thin out. But there was almost, and of course, she found that to be not the success everybody was looking for. What they were hopefully seeing was that all of this would be shared leadership and shared cultures and shared influence. And really, it just seems like it doesn't work. So we're kind of back to highlighting why? Why is this the one that we have the hardest time with? And it seems like you're already pulling on some of those threads. I know the three of us had done a podcast at one time, a number of years ago, where we were just asking questions like, what would Jesus have done if he were here during our time? Would he have shown up at a protest? What would he have said about race relations? Would he have defended these people or accused those people? How would he have dealt with? And just asking those questions caused people to thin out. Caused people to just say, you know what, if you're even talking about that, I'm gone. And that's just such a sad part of what we're wrestling with.
Never mind that people in your congregation or in your communities are hurting.
Yeah.
And we don't want to address that. Never mind that people have like been feeling this oppression for years and don't know what to do with it and want a relationship with Jesus and want a community that at least just says, we see you.
Exactly.
Like, never mind all of that. It makes you uncomfortable.
I think to add on that,
so-
never mind the people in your community are hurting is there's people aren't in their community that are minorities for some of these people. Like they're not
That's a
at their
good point.
table, they're not in their
That's a good
circle.
point.
So it's like out of sight, out of mind kind
Yeah.
of thing. So
point.
Or even if they're at the church, they might not be in community with the people
Yes.
who have power
Yeah.
and who are making those decisions on what to speak out on a Sunday.
Yeah. When you were talking, John, earlier before you started citing the study from Ohio, the way you were describing Jesus like really got me in my feels. Like almost like you were preaching. You're like, and he said this and the cheek and the what, and all I could think was like, that's Jesus.
Yeah.
So if you loved what you heard there,
yeah.
that is
Yeah.
that is what having a relationship with Jesus is. That is what Christianity should be. Those are the types of things he talked about and believed in. So I just want to encourage, like, we're all frustrated. We're all still trying to be involved in a church, clinging to our faith in this world that is so just torn in every direction.
Yeah.
And we validate because we see this issue, like we see it, and I'm sure like viewers see it and feel it. Like if you care about it, we know it's a problem in the church, right? We know it is a problem and we need to figure out solutions or whatever. But at the base of it, like for me, the encouragement is don't walk away from your faith because God, that is who God is.
Yeah.
It's like not the politics that are happening
Yeah.
in the elder board and around. That's who God is. And that was like such a good reminder. I'm like, yes, Jesus turning things upside down like than what people thought and like really pushing further in a radical way because he cared about justice and the heart and
It's like recovering the real Jesus from who culture has said Jesus
Yes.
to
Yeah.
be. You have to like let Jesus speak for himself and just
Right.
read the damn book. Like he's in there and he's awesome. And
can find him.
like what does the Lord require of you? Micah 6:8 to act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly. That is the
Yep.
requirement
Yes.
of you that the Lord requires of you. That's what his
Right.
followers should be like and
Exactly.
look like.
Right.
And it's so frustrating because you have all these other voices in the culture saying Jesus wants you to do this. He wants you to be around these kinds of people. He wants you to have this kind of house and be in this kind of community. And it's so frustrating.
But we have to be clear that like so many church leaders also have bought into it, right? So I don't know how to make that segregation between them where you can say there are some people who are faithfully trying to interpret the scriptures and call us back. And we're going to talk about that in a moment because it still doesn't always work,
Yeah.
right? But there are whole other parts of the church, I think, that have actually accepted the enculturated Jesus because it fits where they are and it fits where their context is. And there it's hard because then you're thinking like, look, my pastor says this or my church believes this.
Yeah.
And you listen to some of the things that are said. And yes, we can all make caricatures out of it and say it's really more conservative than it is Christian. It's really more Republican than it is Christian. It's really more right-wing or Christian nationalist than it is Christian. But it doesn't matter because it's being said in a church. So you go, and if you're not an incredibly discerning person, and you're probably not because you grew up in that community, you grew up in that church, you grew up in that area.
or you're
and
new to it and walk into that.
And you go in Sunday after Sunday and somebody is, they're telling Jesus at a slant. They're using things selectively. They're picking up certain things. And you don't know because we live in such an illiterate time where people just don't read the Bible. They don't know anymore. They're just passing along memes of the Bible. So we're kind of haunted by the Bible, but we don't actually know it well enough so that we
It's
can
like a
walk in.
bad game of telephone.
Yeah.
Really bad.
And so you hear somebody, like basically telling you what you already want to hear.
Yeah.
And this may be an exaggeration, but I mean, I've heard sermons that say, like Jesus would be for gun rights. And like, I mean, that then we might just gasp at that, but at the same time, like somebody could make that case, and if nobody challenged it, you'd go home and say, "Well, he cited a couple Bible verses, and it does already kind of match what I think." And look, I'm not saying that there isn't somebody out there who's teaching a sermon that Jesus would be for gun control and also abusing the scripture, right?
Yeah.
Like
It's
it's
not
happening on both sides,
Yeah.
but we don't even recognize it. So when it comes to this issue in particular, that's what concerns me.
Yeah.
Is that that's happening, and yet we haven't left. And I think that's a point that we should point out, is that you were talking to people who are troubled by this.
Yeah,
and I think it's
very.
a fair statement to say all four of us have grown up, served, and still attend and serve in mostly predominantly white churches. And so to kind of bring it a little bit more personally, like, why haven't you gone?
What haven't we gone?
Why haven't we left?
Yeah.
I know.
you know,
he asked that earlier. It's like, why did you guys stay? Why did we stay?
Good question, John.
I maybe it's just, I mean, look, it's not accidental. Like this happens to a lot of different people who find, I mean, I'll start with me. Like I've always been attracted to the solid theological foundations,
Yeah.
right? And
I'm
the
similar to
emphasis
you in
on
that.
evangelism and the emphasis on a true belief in Jesus and a commitment. And I see that a lot of those places, in many of those churches do well in these areas, right?
Yeah.
So there's the part where you're like, I was attracted to learning at such a deep level how to follow Jesus, true discipleship, really thinking through issues.
Being
There's
challenged.
there's an intellectual tradition that goes back hundreds of years that I've
Right.
been part of, right? And yet, never fully 100% comfortable in it, right? And seeing things that just seem either from downright goofy to downright offensive, like somewhere on that continuum. And I'm sure all of you have experienced
and
that.
offensive.
Yeah, there's there's
sometimes.
goofy.
I had a
right?
goofy / offensive interaction at that church the first time I went to it.
Yeah, I think that we and some of them like, you just think, gosh, this is so crazy. But other times you think, oh, this is crazy to a level where I'm not sure that I should continue here. Like, but
Yeah,
we
that's like a
have.
whole other,
So tell me why. I mean, maybe Aaron, you want to start like you're in that situation where you've been ministering in that context. Like, why?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it is like personal relationship, where I've seen people I've been in a relationship for almost 20 years, start to transform and see the way that they've grown. And I'm like, okay, the Spirit of God is working in your life. It's hard to deny that. It's hard to deny and say like, yeah, even if I don't agree with you on X, Y, Z, I still see the way that you've grown and shifted and maybe grown in your understanding of race over the past 20 years. So personal relationship is one. I think second is, oh, wow, that's hard. I think maybe that's the only reason. No.
like, I know them well enough to know they're not all bad. So I just kind of stuck it through.
He's rethinking his entire position
Yeah.
right here, live on the podcast.
While you're thinking that, I have a question for you. Like, as a person of color in church leadership, it's easy to say, it's so easy to say it from the outside, like, well, you should just fight the system from within, stay so that you can be the one that educates and brings that. But like, aren't you ever just sick of having that on your shoulders? Like, why am I the one that's carrying this ish for you guys? And like,
every day. I think the struggle that comes with that is that people want to say, okay, fight from the inside. I'm like, okay, if you fight from the inside, there is a cost. And depending on the season of life, sometimes that cost has been health, sometimes that cost has been family health, sometimes that cost has been like the cost of my actual job, the ministry that I'm supposed to be leading. And so, I had a situation where I had to basically move things up the chain and kind of call my leadership to the mat about a couple of issues. And, they're like, why didn't you say anything before? And it was because I was listening. I was listening to y'all say that you didn't care about this. I was listening to y'all say and act in a way that meant like when I did bring this up, it was going to be a fight. And so I knew that I had to wait until I had the energy, the resources, the mental health and fortuity to bring this up and do it in a way where I'm not coming out of my brokenness and my hurt, but I'm doing it in a way that actually calls us to a higher standard as a church, not just because I'm hurt and broken.
or anger.
Or anger, yeah. And then to do that as someone who's not on a leadership team or who is kind of middle management and maybe the youngest person at our church, like that just requires a lot of energy to do. And so, I think a lot of, as I am staying, I'm counting the cost. And I think it will reach a point where I'm like, the cost is not worth
too
it.
great.
And I will walk away. And I don't feel shame about that. Because I think of the verse in Matthew where, Jesus says, all right, go out 2 by 2 to the towns And if you get to a town and they don't receive you, then shake off your dust and go on to the next one. And so that's hard. Yeah. It's not easy, and it's not easy when you love the people that you're actually
or that
working
you're
with.
pouring years into that. I mean, that's also traumatic. It's a grieving of a loss of a relationship if it gets to the point that you have to walk away.
Yeah.
But I'll just say, I mean, thank you for doing that. I don't know how often you're validated, but that's such important work. So yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to say that.
You're incredible.
Yeah.
Like that's not easy to carry that for so long too, and without allies maybe on your leadership, and to to do that alone is really, really hard. And but I'm speaking this because I know you too. You have a heart for the people you're serving, and you have a heart for that church, and that's what's kind of been fueling you despite your tiresome.
Yeah.
And it's a big and beautiful heart, and that calling will follow you whatever town you go to.
Yeah.
You're in the same context, right?
Oh, yeah.
In the same kind of thing. So
She's like, oh, wait, yeah.
So what about you?
I'm in ministry too.
like, we're serving in a church that, when we first got there around the same time, about 4 years ago, was almost entirely white, right? And skewed much older,
white.
Right? And over the last 3 or 4 years, as these topics have come up and they've been actually talked about, we've seen some of that thinning out, but we've also seen an influx. I mean, how many churches grow younger? This church has been growing younger and younger. It's miraculous to see a church that's, over 100 years old, going younger and younger each week, seeing more young people, more diverse congregants coming in. Yeah. But you still feel that, right? There's still that weight, I think, on you from a variety of places, of people expecting you to represent a certain community, from people expecting you to explain things, for you having to bring things up that seem obvious that nobody else had even caught or talked about. I mean, so how do you navigate that? Like, do you ever feel like I can only do this for so long, or this is necessary work, and in this season of my life, this is what I should be doing to help the church in this area?
It feels like necessary work for me. I'm like, I have a motivation to be part of the change, but it's exhausting because it's been 4 years and I'm exhausted. I think the difference though is that our leadership, our head pastor has been like, I want this. Like the leadership has to want it. And the staff, or like the people I need to be part of a team, not just out here fending for myself against my team. That's where I would be like, okay, then I'm just, like, I'm wasting my
upstream.
I'm fighting. It's a lose-lose situation. I'm lucky enough to have a leadership that's constantly checking up on me, wanting the same thing I'm wanting. Yeah. Brought me on because they wanted it first, not I came in with the agenda. They were like, we want this. Wisdom come in. What can we do to here's the budget. Like they trusted me at a young age. I came in there and they gave me ownership to do different things, to start a young adults group, to be a voice in places that was 4 years ago. I was fresh out of undergrad. And they were like, hey, come into the worship planning meeting. And they said, hey, Wisdom, what did you feel? Did you feel welcome? Can you give us some critique? Like, what did you, and I was like, oh, I'm literally 22, 23, and you're asking me for my opinion and implementing change. Yeah. So I think that is what's fueling me, where I'm like not as tired because there is tiresome, but I have a team. And I think that's important for churches. If you want that, find those people and encourage them. Like if Aaron's doing what he's doing without encouragement and without a team, then burnout's going to happen like that. And it's going to be a waste of everybody's time. You need to do it together, not just one person kind of going in there. And that's, it has to come from leadership. It has to come from partnership and teamwork. And so I think God's really blessed that because it's a congregation of us wanting the same thing, a group of us wanting the same thing, rather than just me out there trying to make a change by myself.
Yeah.
And this change has to come, by the way, not just from the efforts that we're all trying to make. I think that it would be a total miss to not mention the spiritual component of this struggle, right?
Yeah.
Somebody estimated that 20% of Jesus's teachings focused on the spiritual realm, right? Not just good teachings about the ways we're supposed to follow his commandments, but literally the spiritual elements and the dark forces that want to prevent those things from happening, right? Yeah. And I think in this area, this is an interesting thing for me, that so many Christians believe, like you could say, do you believe in the devil? Like, yeah, I mean, they might have different beliefs on what that means. Yeah. Do you believe that there are dark forces in the world? Yeah. Yes, I do. But all those dark forces are just trying to take away Christian freedom. None of those dark forces have embedded
long time
themselves
to say.
into law, into people's hearts that, create prejudices and biases. None of those dark forces
Spirits of oppression.
Right.
Like,
None of those dark forces have torn churches apart and polarized people. None of those dark forces are embedded into political parties. It seems like those dark forces only, they're just in like one narrow area. And I think that is the place where we just have to call it out. Those dark forces that exist, that Jesus talked about, that are very real, that Paul called the principalities and the powers, they embed themselves into power structures. They embed themselves into laws because we are evil people. And then we go legislate together, which is already a big soup of compromises and special interests and money. And I taught public policy for a while, and I think everybody knows this, but nobody can make the next leap, which is, so if a bunch of broken people make lots of compromises with moneyed interests who are themselves trying to maintain their own special interests, the laws that come out are perfectly like birds chirping and butterflies flying, and they're equal and everybody benefits, and that is absolutely not true.
Yep.
We know corporations win. We know that like certain moneyed interests always win. We know that special interests win. Why would it be so hard to believe that certain people oppressed other people using those laws, especially when they were the only ones making the laws? And I think when we say something like that,
right there,
right, when we say something like that and go, and everything I just described, that's a spiritual issue that the dark forces and the devil himself used to bake into our laws. And then, so now I'm going to use the word that you can't hear because you're going to leave as soon as you hear it. That's structural in a way. That is precisely what happens if you make a bunch of Jim Crow laws, or if you just say that anybody from a minority community cannot live in this neighborhood, and I'm going to write it into the deed. It's in the deed, right? That's a form of structural issues. Or I'm going to write a law that treats people differently, knowing that this group breaks this law and this group breaks that law. So I'll just write the penalties differently, right? That's what we mean.
Are you saying that's institutional racism?
Systemic racism?
Like the idea that these spiritual elements, and the reason before I go into like, what do we do about that? I just want to say with none of us, I think, even myself, think that what we should be doing is praying against those kinds of spiritual influences and approaching our churches, not just with, hey, I have a great idea, or let's do this, or thank you for listening to me, but to actually pray for the fact that this is an oppression that, maybe nobody wants to worship the devil, but all of us for some reason are tempted to deny his work in all these areas. And then watch the impact and actually side with those dark forces by leaving over anybody who's trying to address the impact of those choices, right? That's terrible. But Aaron, how do you address somebody who says to you, like in the church context you're in, and I'm sure this happens, which is, what is there something like I'm not responsible for this, and it's not baked into the system. It isn't in there. Like everybody's just free and equal in this country. I mean, do you have to ever address that with anyone in your church context?
Thankfully, I think people are scared of me. Like I'm joking, but I'm not. Like I think it's interesting seeing the way that this plays out. Is that I don't get a lot of those critiques. Also, because I'm middle management, people go over my head and they complain to like bosses and things like that.
Love that.
But I pretty rarely get people coming up to me and being like, I don't really think that's real. But I do think it's because I think of when I have spoken like deeply about the pain that I've experienced because of these structural forces. But I think I'm in a point in my journey where I'm like, I no longer am trying to be winsome and win people over to my side. That's no longer the goal for me. When I talk about racism, when we talk about systemic oppression, all these different things, I want to see, okay, who in the room that I'm either in charge of or that I'm in, who in the room is suffering the most because of this? How can I support them? How can I empower them? How can I lift them up? And I think shifting that perspective has kind of changed, like, oh, well, I don't need to convince Joe Schmo over here who's voted for Trump 2 times and will vote for him again and believes that Black Lives Matter is the devil and all these different things. I don't have to convince them that I'm right. What I do need to figure out is how can I resource the person who's going to suffer because of this person? And that's very interpersonal in the way that I just described it, but I also want to do that institutionally as well and really draw that out.
Yeah. I think this issue is tough because we all probably have our own biases about what our relationship is with the country and the culture, and what our relationship is with the church, and those formulations get challenged in this area quite a bit. I'm thinking about somebody who interned for me many years while he was in seminary, and he reached out to me in 2021 and said, I'd like to do a series on biblical justice. And he was very clear. I want to do it on biblical justice. I want to preach from the Bible about economic justice, the year of the Jubilee, the forgiveness of debts. I want to preach from Isaiah. I want to preach from Amos. Like, I'm not going anywhere. I want to preach from Jesus's inaugural sermon from the book of Isaiah about setting the captives free. Like, I want to preach on that. Will you help me to write it? Because I had done several sermon series on this, and we wrote it together, remotely because we were like far away. He's ministering in the Midwest. And it was all, I know the content of the sermon because I reviewed it every week. It was all biblical, and the church thinned out over the issues because they thought it was getting too close to, and then what is the issue again? The issue is challenging what somebody viewed as their relationship to the culture, to the country, and to their own race, right? In one of the sermons, I think that really was probably the straw that broke the camel's back, he mentioned that in their community, there had been this practice of actually writing into deeds that minorities could not live in the entire suburbs that were developed, and said that these were until recently finally overturned by the courts. But he asked just openly, do you think this is a reason why we don't have any minorities living in our communities? That these deeds that were enforced for 70, 80 to 100 years, and when they were finally not enforced, they just kind of kept going. They just kind of, they were
common
set in
sense would
stone.
say yes.
Yeah.
Like, of course.
Yeah.
And he used this analogy of the idea of, like, let's say you're running a race, because in this country, everybody wants to say everybody's equal, everybody's meritorious, like there's nobody running a race, and actually telling somebody like you're going to be tied up at the start line for 7 years while the other guy runs, and then I want you to catch him at some point and say like, we're all equal, free to run. And just even saying that out loud drew so many people. And I'm going to say that eventually that almost ended the whole church in some way. And that's the thing that I think is really hard.
That shows how deep that spiritual stronghold that you're talking about, that dark spiritual stronghold, that's how insidious and how deep that is.
Yeah.
And I like that you brought that up because I kind of wanted to circle it back to, like as we've been discussing, I feel like I'm getting more clarity here. And the biggest issue is that as Christians, we need to know that it is a spiritual issue. And I think that's why people are walking away, because they're forgetting that it's a spiritual issue. So not diversity for diversity's sake, not for political skew, but for the fact that it is a spiritual issue. These types of oppressions. And that's the thing. And then the other end of that coin, earlier when wisdom and when you were talking about doing that podcast and how things thinned out. But okay, what's the other end of it? Now your church is younger, it's more diverse, but those people left and did something.
Where'd they
So
go?
where'd they go? So now we're getting maybe
They
like-minded.
started a church of their own.
That's what I'm saying. They're like, let's go to the all-white, like-minded, or
call it our
all
church
whatever.
plant.
I don't want to even just say white, but all like-minded, whatever we are place. It's almost empowering that thought, right? And I think something that's that we have to be so careful of is putting ourselves in an echo chamber. It's so dangerous when you have no one to push back on your ideas or to keep you honest or to convict you. Like when you're just surrounding yourself, people like, yeah, we think this is right, so it must be right, and there's no pushback. So that's the other side of it. Like the place that you're at transformed, and I'm sure and is transforming, and I'm sure that will spill out into the community, and so much good will come from that. And maybe even seeds were planted in the people who left, but there's still the other side where these people left and went somewhere.
And they could perpetuate where they take it, right? And we are seeing, look, politically across the country, we're seeing this great sorting, right? People are sorting themselves into the echo chambers you just said we shouldn't have. That's happening politically. And of course, the problem politically is that we spend probably 10, 15, 20, 30 hours being influenced by whatever kind of tribes we follow online or on cable news or whatever.
Yeah.
And we spend an hour, 2 or 3 on any kind of spiritual formation. So we're overwhelmed to begin with.
Yeah.
But on top of that, when you get this kind of sorting, it doesn't help because it just means that there aren't anyone there to challenge. There just isn't anyone to challenge those views.
Yeah.
Right. And again, you didn't want to be challenged. That's why you left. That's why you went somewhere else, because you didn't want to be challenged. And I do think that it is a spiritual issue because so many pastors have been wounded trying to address it. That's what, if you're listening to this and you think the church is just, not doing enough on this, yes, I would say there's a good part of the church that is all too comfortable not doing anything from this, and we'll address that in a moment. But there are so many that have been wounded by this. If you just look at the surveys where you ask pastors, for example, like, do you think that there's issues of structural racism in our society? The amount of pastors who agree with that are much higher than the congregants they're leading.
Yes.
Right? And so when they step out and say something like, okay, this is an area, let's attack something like payday lending, right? Let's not even get into racial issues. Let's talk about economic issues like payday lending, oppresses certain poor and minority communities more than it does other areas. They're going to get attacked. They're going to get wounded. Some of their best friends are going to shoot arrows at them. Their elder board might, start questioning whether they're the right person. There's been examples, where the people have just departed over those issues. And if you think that they just kind of shrug their shoulders, I mean, nothing wounds a pastor more than watching people walk out and say all sorts of things about you behind your back, rumors started, you're not spiritual, you're not preaching the gospel, you've lost the faith, and pronouncing these judgments on you. And if you think they could just kind of shrug and say, well, look, everybody else is still here. I mean, they go home and they wonder whether they should do that job ever again. And I've seen it. I've sat with pastors, so many of them that went through this over the craziest issues. So there is a whole group out there that's trying, and they're just getting so much pushback. And at some point, they might give in. They might feel like, I don't have more energy in me to fight another battle. Our budget has literally been shot by the people who took their money and left the church. Like, there are realities. So we just want people to address that. But the answer, again, pray for those people who are trying. Right? Pray for all of those people.
Or step into those spaces.
And
take up
encourage
space
them.
in those churches.
Don't be part of the problem, right?
Yeah.
Like, and if you're on the sidelines just waiting for everybody to sort it out, then you're not in the fight. Get involved. And follow Jesus the right way too, and show that it can be done. I mean, nothing also is more life-giving to a pastor than when they actually start to take something on that has been an issue, and they see people coming in saying, I'm with you.
I'm
with
see the
you on this.
transformation.
I'm with you on this. When a pastor recovers that the entire civil rights movement was the greatest nonviolent, Jesus-following movement of its time, probably in the last 400 or 500 years, right? Like this
Some might call it a revival.
Image.
Yes.
And then it came from the church, led by people, and yet, I know it's got that history where white pastors stood against it for a long time, right? Where there was, like, we shouldn't get involved in politics. Oh, until the issues are our issues, and then we should be diving into politics, right? Right. I know that. We could all point fingers at that and shake our heads and wag fingers, but at the end of the day, don't sit on the sidelines on this. Like, if you want to get in, it's going to encourage the people who are trying to lead this, I think, in a great way.
And it's not easy to follow Jesus, and it will cost you things.
Yes.
And I just think you have to prepare yourself for like the cost when you're engaging in something that's important like that. I mean, I literally showed up to, there was a picture of me at a Black Lives Matter protest, and my best friend never talked to me again. No argument, no discussion, just saw the photo.
Who was also a believer.
Who is also a believer, who for years we were on opposite ends of the political spectrum, used to meet together on election day to pray and vote together. And we're like, the thing that unites us is Christ. And we would have like a really good debate. And he would say, oh, I could see how your faith has shaped why you choose this political. So we used to have this open dialogue, and then this insidious thing stepped in. And I think a lot of good spiritually could have continued to come out from our friendship, and now it's broken. So that dark spiritual force wins there, right? And then all of a sudden it just gets to a point where I was your best friend, and now I won't even take your phone call.
And I think the spiritual consequence of those kind of hurt relationships can't be overemphasized. At our church, the pastor had a very close family that was like their best friends in every part of their life,
Yeah.
who walked out of the church because they thought that we were going to be a church that was going to start talking about critical race theory. That was the,
And they probably don't even know what that is.
Right. But it was never even mentioned.
Right.
Right. But the idea that he had quoted from a couple of books written by Black theologians, or had cited
James
something.
Cone?
Yeah. Or even
So
cited Martin Luther
crazy.
King as a pastor commenting on the scripture we were studying, not just a general
Yeah.
statement, but literally
Wow.
like saying, here's something
unbelievable.
that was said by another person with a PhD who just happened to be MLK and who commented on this passage, right, was enough to but the thing I want to point out is the damage that was done.
Yeah.
And the way that you could almost see, like, I don't know that you would survive 2 or 3 more of these in
those.
your
Yeah.
lifetime
More
before
evidence
you as
that it's a
pastor.
spiritual issue.
Right.
Like,
Those
just
were around the
more-
same time that our podcast came out too, and like it just that exodus of a conglomerate of people leaving was just heartbreaking. Not for our head pastor and for people at our church that stayed. It was like, I thought you were my brother or sister. I thought we were
in it.
I thought we were doing this
Yeah.
together. When this pastor came in, this was the family that was like, hey, I'm with you. Let's do this. And it's just heartbreaking
Yeah.
it's heartbreaking for the family. It's heartbreaking for church family. It's heartbreaking for children whose children, like, they can't, you got to recover from that. Just like John said, you can't just shake it off. I think maybe something helpful for Christians who are afraid to jump in and are like hesitant, a reminder that I think Jesus calls us to have nothing to protect, nothing to possess, nothing to prove. That's part of the deal of following Jesus. Just follow me, and we don't gotta.
Yep.
Yeah.
He who does not give up everything he has cannot be my disciple is kind of one of those like ringing statements that or to pick up your cross and follow him. I want to ask you guys
execution.
from that perspective, like, okay, talk to the person who's right now thinking, all right, this is a mess. You guys have convinced me it's a mess. I'm not stepping in. I'm not, until you guys sort this out. Now I know why I don't go to church. Now I know why I'm leaving the faith. You guys are just proving for me that it's even more messy than I might imagine when I look behind the curtain. And we've just given them carte blanche to just leave. Talk to that person, because all of us haven't left.
I guess my question to that person would be, do you think Nancy Pelosi and her like kente cloth can change it? Like, do you think that the political structures that we have, or the other institutions, have the power to change this?
Or is God calling you?
Or is it as simple as be the change you want to be in the world? Like, I know that's a corny quote, but at the same time, I'm like, if you think that this is so broken that there's no hope, I can't resonate that, because I look at the gospel and I see Paul, who executed Jews for believing in Jesus, and seeing how he meets Jesus on a road and is transformed. I see that. And I see just this element of transformation that's all throughout the Gospels. I see this hope that's in Revelation, where all peoples of all tribes of all tongues are sitting together, singing together in their own language, glorifying God, saying that he's, almighty, holy, holy, holy. And I look at that vision, and I look at the vision of God wiping every tear from our eye, and all of the mourning and all of the crying and all the pain passing away. And I see, that's a pretty compelling mission. And if I get to participate in that, and if that's what's awaiting for me at the end of time,
Yeah.
and if I get to step into glory with all of my brothers and sisters who have been walking alongside me for years, thousands of years, attacking their own issues in their time and their day, and saying, we need to transform this for Jesus. We need to transform this for the kingdom. That is what keeps me going.
Yeah.
Is knowing that this is not the end. This is just a season of life. This is a season, but we have a much higher, much more beautiful thing to strive for.
It's not the end, and also it's already begun.
Amen.
Like Jesus said, like, my kingdom is initiated now. Like, go be agents of it now.
Yeah.
Now. We don't, like, the complete picture that, like, it's there, it's coming, but now it's already initiated. Like, it's starting already. I need you to be a part of it and be agents of my goodness. I have opportunities for you. Just, like, step in.
Right. Yeah, and just to kind of piggyback off of that too, again, on the other side of it, my thought is we're all broken, we're all human. So if you think this is only a church problem, it isn't. So you can come out of church and invest in something else, and you're going to find the same structures, power struggles, the same brokenness. So like literally whatever you choose to be a part of, whatever community, whether you're a Christian or not, or whatever it is, you're going to encounter the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's important to point out, is that running away from the church, leaving the church, turning your back on your faith, not engaging in it is not going to now magically send you into a world where it's fixed.
Yep.
It's just going to send you to the next thing with more of it. Yeah. So it's like, choose wisely like where you want to engage in that, because a relationship with Jesus is so powerful, beautiful, freeing. All the things you said earlier about his character, all the things that you that is like Jesus. To me, that's worth stepping into. That's what has the power to transform the world in these ways. So I think that's what keeps me going, is like knowing all of that. It's like, I got to keep going, because this is going to be everywhere anyways.
Yeah.
So why not participate in like something so beautiful?
Yes.
Yeah.
And if you look at the history, the abolitionist movement was led by Christians. The civil rights movement was led by Christians. When we get rid of mass incarceration, it's going to be led by Christians.
Yes.
And do you want to hop on that wave or not?
And it should be, right?
Should be.
Like, because we serve a Lord who tells us that he is the truth and he is peace.
Yeah.
Like, and he is God in the flesh, coming to empower his church to do more than even, he said, you'll do greater things. Like, you will do these things, right? And we don't want to abdicate that. We don't want to abandon that to everyone else, right? Because then that's the part of it. And I think to the person who's also talking about all those broken systems you just mentioned, we ourselves are broken. Like, I might have a lot to say on this issue, but there's other areas in my life where I'm totally broken and need the church to heal me and show me my blind sides. And all of that can only be done with a healing. Like, look, lots of people can address solutions for the world and solve problems for the world. Only Christ can heal in a way that is permanent and eternal, right? And it is whole and creates this level, like takes away sin, sorrow, and death, and all of these things. That's the only way. And you either join what he's doing, right? Yes, we're all broken. Yes, and it's going to be a struggle. And yes, you're going to see that the churches are run by people just like you or just as messed up as you. So when we attack these things, it's really to make them better, but we never can like stand at a distance and point at it and say, well, that thing is all messed up, because we're messed up. Right? And we need that healing as much as anything. And I mean, for Christ to say, come and be part of my body and find salvation in this world and the next through my body, the church, that's an important thing that we just can't write off and think, oh, that's just institutional religion. Not in the case of Jesus. He said it was personally part of his body to do. I think the last admonition I'd give to somebody about this is maybe you're somebody who your whole conception of church has been shaped by one of those that I talked about that has wholly supported these systems, that wholly has just kind of given in or has been kind of taken hostage in some way in their thinking by an ideology, not just by theology. They've decided in advance that we need to support a certain view, or that we need to support a certain party, or we need to not alienate everybody in our community, so we're going to just follow whatever they already believe, and then I'm going to read the Bible that way. What I'd say to you is there are churches that are trying very hard and are doing a great job of not doing that. Maybe in your community, that's not the case. Then you need to do the work and take responsibility to find churches that are doing these things, that are actually trying to stand for a good and proper Jesus, following interpretation of the scripture that is not steeped in American culture, not steeped in nationalism, but is actually what Jesus of Nazareth taught when he gave us his way, his kingdom ethic, and said, be part of my kingdom, be a citizen of my kingdom. And there are churches that are doing that. We don't always get it right. We all have biases we don't see. We all will read theology sometimes in interpretation, sometimes a little bit off. But there are some that maybe in your community you think it's all that way. Then you need to go on a search and find the places that we're talking about. We've all experienced lots of different things, but we're all still trudging on every single day because God has forgiven us, and God has given us grace, and God has given us a ministry to do and a task to reach other people. and to help others. And if you're in a place, there are places like that. There is a place that you can find. Maybe it has to be online. If you're in a place where you say, well, even in my own community, I can't find a place like that. Keep looking because Jesus is at work through the church. And even in the places where there's resistance, it says that nothing will overcome the church in the end. So look for those places and get involved and stop standing on the sidelines of this and looking at it from a distance, because all of us are broken. All of us can be part of the solution. And we got a lot of work to do. We need your help. So we're Jesus versus America. Tell us what you think. We'd love to hear from you.
Follow us on all social media platforms at Jesus versus America. And find more resources on our official website, jesusversusamerica.com.